Ramya? Thank you. So welcome today to this panel on the improver's landscape. I'd like to start by giving you just a brief overview, a little bit of what we're going to talk about. And this is primarily, again, a focus on the Midwest, not surprisingly. And we look at the way in which you see this switch from an indigenous perspective on the landscape to what we're calling the improver's landscape. The influx of particularly of people who wish to change the landscape, who no longer saw the notion of subsisting on the landscape's resources, but sought to improve it to increase, quote, the productivity of that landscape. In a sense, what all of these papers are dealing with is creating the framework for the changes that will cause environmental problems, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I'd like to begin first by our first panelist, and that is Dale, who is a first-year graduate student in history at Colorado State University. His research focuses primarily on U.S. environmental history and how it can be used to structure public history sites, particularly in the Trans-Mississippi West. He recently graduated from Michigan State University, where he studied political theory and history with a focus on environmental history. He has recently completed a year-long research project on the Black Swamp, from which he has drawn today's presentation. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Dale, who will talk in this first paper about, quote, draining the swamp, the destruction of essential lands. Dale.
Thank you for that introduction. Let me see if I can get my, can somebody enable the screen sharing, please? No screen sharing?
That might be Samuel. Okay.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Oh, there we go. All right, so my presentation is titled Draining the Swamp, the Destruction of Essential Lands. And as Dr. Sleeper-Smith mentioned, it's a primary focus on the Black Swamp, which is in modern day Ohio for the most part. The Black Swamp was an irregular strip about 30 miles wide, lying parallel to the east bank of the Maumee River from Lake Erie southwest to New Haven, Indiana, and covered some 1,500 square miles. The proposal to drain the swamp was first described in Niles Weekly Register. Quote, the low-lying portions of the country partially covered with water in the winter and spring might in most cases be easily drained, which would render the soil as fertile as it is now rich. They went on in the account to say the Black Swamp probably derived its name from the black, loose, friable foam which characterized the soil in the region, and that the land in general of the lakeside of this state was not inferior in point of fertility to the Ohio Riverside. By the 1850s, as the number of settler colonists increased, measures were taken to drain the swamp, which led to its eventual destruction. This was achieved by using the swamp against itself, taking the clay that lie within and creating tiles that were used alongside ditches to drain the swamp, destroying the ecosystem that once thrived with new tillable soil taking its place. The progress made in draining the Black Swamp roughly parallels the progress of resettlement by incoming Americans in the region. The population number increased from 45,916 people living in the Ohio region in 1800 to 1,577,473 in 1850, showing a large increase in only 2 generations. The large population increase took place after the War of 1812, ending the decades of hostility towards incoming colonialist settlers that followed the American Revolution. Between 1800 and 1811, the Pan-Indian Confederacy led by Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa had resisted white expansion, and in 1810, in negotiations with Governor William Henry Harrison, they warned that they would attack to defend their ancestral lands if settler colonists continued to move west and settle on their lands. As natives began attacking incoming settlers who traveled, had a sense of fear, and westward expansion slowed. Tensions rose, and by November of 1811, Governor Harrison deployed his forces to invade the native settlements located at Prophetstown near the Tippecanoe River. Tecumseh, who had assembled and commanded native forces, was absent, and Tenskwatawa led the native forces to defeat. And after they retreated, the Americans burned the entire town to the ground and destroyed the food supply. Tecumseh returned and led his forces into Canada, where their alliance with British forces led them to oppose U.S. forces in the War of 1812. Harrison's destruction of Prophetstown demonstrated that the U.S. was no longer willing to negotiate with native forces. Despite victories on both sides, the War of 1812 ended in a stalemate for both the British and the Americans, but it was the indigenous people on both sides who lost decisively. Although the Treaty of Ghent accorded native people the same rights they had before the war, it was clear that without British support, the Americans could force native communities to sign a multitude of treaties that ceded their remaining lands to present-day state of Indiana. Matters continued to worsen when the United States Supreme Court in 1823 provided legal cover for fraudulent treaty cessions by ruling that although Indians might legally occupy land, they could not legally own it. The War of 1812 truly marked the beginning of the end for the indigenous autonomy. The number of treaties natives were forced to sign after the war provided a direct line to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, as settlers increasingly viewed westward expansion as safe, and once important native landscapes, such as that of the Great Black Swamp, emerged as places that could be reshaped to meet the needs of incoming farmers. With new settlers arriving to the region following the War of 1812, new technologies and ideas also arrived. Every advance made in the technique of drainage helped to demonstrate the potential fertility of the region. Initially, the first attempts to drain the wetlands relied on plowing the fields into narrow bands separated by dead furrows, which were designed to catch the excess water. The transformative event in draining the swamp came in 1839 with the improvement of the Maumee Western Reserve Road constructed in 1823. Before the improvements, the road was a field of mud, which was only made worse with the use of the road. The horses, wagons, and travelers who used the road found their travel times dramatically increase when they were stuck in the mud. Road improvements included chopping down trees, digging drainage ditches, and macadamizing the roadway by paving it with broken stone. This made it much easier for travelers to journey through the once impossible landscape. With the improved roadway, settlement in the region of the Black Swamp began to take root. The 1820s and 30s saw numerous taverns springing up along the roadway. By 1834, there were over 31 taverns between Fremont and Perrysburg. That's nearly one tavern for every mile of road. While taverns were often rough log cabins, they provided three essential services in the swamp: food, lodging, and teams of oxen that could pull wagons and travelers out of the mud when they became stuck. These taverns gave the settlers to the region jobs, temporary housing, and a place to socialize. When visitors voiced complaints about the road before its paving, they were heard all the way to the state level, which had resulted in 1939 road improvements. These public works projects transformed what was known as the worst road in America into one of the best. After being paved, the presence of stone mile markers in taverns and lodges transformed the Maumee Western Reserve Road into a modern-day highway. This first public works project drew attention to the possibility of draining the Black Swamp, despite the land's gentle gradient, which in many places was less than 4 feet per mile. This increased awareness of the benefits of systematic drainage led to a growing demand for action from the government and led to a passage of an 1859 law which provided for a system of public ditches. These ditches were paid for by the farmers who benefited from them. However, this early ditch law proved inadequate and was subsequently blamed for the slow settlement of Northwest Ohio. Open ditches and furrows proved inadequate for successfully draining the swamp. This was because these were individual efforts and had mixed results. Sometimes they succeeded only in diverting the water onto their neighbor's land. Other times, the ditches would hold stagnant water without adequately draining it at all. This was because underdrains were needed to remove the standing excess water from the soil through a system of underground drains. However, without nearby tile factories, the cost of importing tile was too high, so farmers created underdrains by laying saplings or stones in a trench and covering them with dirt. Wooden underdrains were a later improvement, which were constructed by nailing two boards together in a V shape, which was then inverted and placed into the trench. These underdrains kept the water drained and the soil from being waterlogged itself. These homemade drains, however, were not enough to drain the massive swamp. On average, they lasted a maximum of 15 years before needing to be replaced. The realization that under drainage was highly effective in ridding the land of excess water created a growing demand for tile since it would last much longer. When the first clay tiles were introduced, they were handmade in horseshoe shape with no bottom. Their success led to an increased demand for cheap clay tile and resulted in the construction of tile factories near the swamp. The Black Swamp had an abundance of clay 1 to 2 feet below the surface, and this became the primary resource for making clay tiles. By 1880, more than 50 tile factories began operations in Northwest Ohio. Employees were often members of the same family and worked long, hard days to manufacture approximately 20,000 feet of clay tile per week, primarily by hand. As a consequence, the Black Swamp was soon dismembered and used to feed the accelerating and diversifying cycle of human industry. Since nearly all these factories have closed, however, a few remain in business, such as the Bowman Tile Company, which was established in 1883. It is estimated that there are 35,000 rods, or about 109 miles of tile in place throughout Ohio, which were produced at Ohio-based tile factories. It is estimated that 338,844 people were employed in agriculture and tile manufacturing industries in the region. The connection between the two industries drew people to the region. With newly drained lands and fertile soil, the promise of successful crops loomed in the minds of settlers arriving to the region. Furthermore, because there was no standard currency until after the Civil War, job security in farming and manufacturing played a role in the rapid increase of settlers in and around the Black Swamp by the mid-19th century. Draining the swamp also played a role in the decrease of diseases such as cholera and malaria, which had long plagued newcomers. Native communities living adjacent to the swamp did not suffer from these diseases because they knew how to survive off the land and relied on bear grease and herbs to treat those diseases. White settlers arriving in the region lacked this knowledge about medicinal use of plants and animals, while the newcomers suffered from clouds of swamp mosquitoes, which carried these diseases. While today we recognize this as malaria, the settlers of the time referred to the sickness as ague or marsh fever. Some estimates say as many as 5 of 6 settlers were affected by these diseases and regularly suffered with severe chills, shaking, fever, and profuse sweating. In severe cases, those affected couldn't work in any capacity for several years, and in most severe cases, the sickness was fatal. Another disease that settlers and travelers had fear of was cholera. Cholera infects a person through unclean, untreated water. The disease moves quickly and can kill entire families within hours. The fear that came with the disease caused other settlers to flee the area for fear they would meet the same demise. Cholera pandemics are noted in records to have struck Ohio, including the area of the Black Swamp, numerous times in the mid-1800s. In draining the swamp, the number of mosquitoes declined, as well as the amount of standing water, which led to decreased levels of sickness in the area. As the fear of these diseases lessened, settlers moved into the area to take advantage of a thriving job market and promise of fertile farmland. The decline of disease in the swamp and the correlation between the water and disease further increased public demand to drain the land. Completely draining the land utterly transformed the Black Swamp into a vast expanse of new farmland. By the 1850s, the 1800 population level of less than 50,000 people had soared to over 1.5 million people. The swamp was formed when receding glaciers of the Ice Age pushed the soil out in front and deposited rich soils across Northwest Ohio, creating a level of topsoil nearly 90 feet deep. For this reason, the land of the Great Black Swamp was viewed as some of the most fertile in the United States, perhaps even the world. The swamp was used against itself by removing the clay that lie within the swamp to create tiles that lined the drainage ditches to eliminate the swamp and destroy its ecosystem, creating farmland to take its place. Over time, farming not only depleted the soil of nitrogen and phosphorus, but as farmers added manure and later synthetic fertilizer, the soil's nutrients were taken up by crops, but most of it washed down into the ditches, flowing into the Maumee and Sandusky rivers and onto Lake Erie. Retaining the Great Black Swamp would have curtailed the problem of agricultural runoff and lessened the level of pollution in the nearby streams and rivers. Right now, when there are heavy rains or if fertilizer is not mixed into the soil properly, the nitrate and phosphorus-rich soils drain into the rivers that feed into Lake Erie. These increased pollutants have now changed entire ecosystems that sustain the health of the waters. Perhaps one of the more obvious cases of pollution in North America can be seen in the accelerated eutrophication of Lake Erie. Eutrophication is the process by which a body of water becomes enriched in dissolved nutrients such as phosphates, which stimulate the growth of aquatic plant life and lead to the depletion of dissolved oxygen. Eutrophication causes algae to grow and depletes the water needed by the natural plants and wildlife that live under the surface. In the case of Lake Erie and the rivers that flow into it, there is evidence that the fish population has decreased with increased eutrophication. The pollutants in Lake Erie infiltrating the waterways and contaminating the large supply of human drinking water that comes from Lake Erie. It is clear that elimination of black swamp lies at the root of the pollution problem, which has been clearly summarized by Undark magazine, which states, quote, the tough people who conquered the Great Black Swamp did so at great personal expenses, and they've passed down a deep and abiding loathing of wetlands. They are considered a menace, a threat, a thing to be overcome. These attitudes are enshrined in state law, which makes it impossible for any action, including wetland restoration, that slows the flow of runoff through those miles of constructed drainage ditches, the very conduits after each heavy rainfall that deliver thousands of metric tons of phosphorus and nitrogen to the Maumee and onward to Lake Erie, from which millions of people drink. At one point, the pollution in the Cayuga River became so bad that on June 22nd, 1969, a spark from the train tracks fell into the river below and ignited the industrial debris floating on the surface of the water. Flames spread across the river and in some places reached 5 stories high. This event sparked environmental policy reform in Ohio, but without the Great Black Swamp working as a natural filter, these policies limit what can be done. While many tend to see environmental issues as a modern problem, the reality is that our environmental problems are rooted in human actions of the past. Because of the destruction of the Great Black Swamp and the elimination of 90% of Ohio's wetlands, there is no longer a natural filter for these waterways, and this has magnified the problems caused by pollution. Bringing back the swamp and restoring the ecosystems that once thrived there has been the primary focus of groups such as the Black Swamp Conservancy. This group, founded in 1993, was founded by a group of people who were alarmed by the rapidly accelerating rate of development and destruction of natural habitats in rural Northwest Ohio. Their mission is to protect and preserve natural and agricultural lands in Northwest Ohio for the benefit of future generations. Groups such as the Black Swamp Conservancy defend the environment and do their best to restore landscapes back to their previous ecosystems by creating nature reserves that revert the swamp back to what it once was. There has already been some success as seen by an increase in fish populations and the lessening of contaminated water in the areas they have worked in. Without a sound environment, humans run the risk of extinction by destroying important ecosystems and environments around the world, similar to that of the Black Swamp. Groups such as the Black Swamp Conservancy speak on behalf of the environment and work to return it to what it once was for the betterment of the environment and to sustain human life. However, the question is it too late?
Thank you very much, Dale. That was a great presentation. I'd like to turn now to another presenter, and this is John Nelson, who is an assistant professor at Texas Tech. He specializes in the history of early America with an emphasis on the borderlands of indigenous North America and the colonial Atlantic world. I have just disappeared, so I apologize, but you may still hear my voice. There we go. His research examines the way ecology and geography shape the terms of cross-cultural interaction between Native peoples and European colonizers from first contact through the early Republican era of the United States. He has drawn today's paper from the final chapter of his book manuscript, provisionally entitled 5 Miles of Muddy Ground, Native Peoples, Europeans, and the Chicago Portage. His research today explores how Indian removal and internal improvements around Chicago went hand in hand during the late 1820s into the 1830s, reshaping both the human and physical geography of the region. So with that, welcome, John.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to everyone who's joining today. I'm going to share my screen if I can here. And let me know if you can't see it, but that's where we'll be picking up. Okay, so I also pick up right around the end of the War of 1812 and kind of follow this intertwined story of indigenous removal and internal improvements at Chicago. So with peace returning to the Great Lakes in 1815, U.S. military personnel made plans to scout the upper reaches of the Illinois River for the first time, with an eye towards a canal project that could unite the waters of Lake Michigan with the drainage of the Mississippi watershed at Chicago. And in 1816, Major Stephen Long, one of the U.S. Army's 6 engineers at the time, led a trip up the Illinois River to conduct this first scientific report on Chicago's portage and the Continental Divide there. His findings provided encouragement for the wider government project of transforming the Old Northwest into U.S. space, and specifically highlighted the value of Chicago's geography to this new American republic in the region. Long encouraged a general federal investment in public works across the region, quote, because no part of the United States can afford greater facilities or exhibit more powerful inducements for the construction of public canals and national roads, end quote. Long described how waterways bisected the lands of the southern Great Lakes to benefit transportation, and he reckoned that these may be considered the cords which will unite the northern interests of the country. Long was prescribing a grand design of public works and what he called internal improvements that could connect the West, echoing back to suggestions that had been made as early as the French period at Chicago, relying on the waterways of the region to hold together an imperial, or in this case, a U.S. federal system. Officials had already tried to bring this vision of order to the West by fortifying the portage at Chicago during the early 1800s. But these efforts had failed spectacularly in the disintegration of an orderly garrison there, the outbreak of war, and the culminating violence of the U.S. defeat at the Battle of Fort Dearborn in 1812. After the War of 1812, U.S. officials would begin to formulate a new strategy for order in the West, one that relied less on frontier fortifications and military expenditures and more on the types of internal improvements proposed by officials like Long. In the Great Lakes region, this fervor for infrastructure became wrapped up in the same official impulses to bring control to a disorienting borderland in which the economy still revolved around indigenous transportation systems, fur trade relations, and native power. In the end, Chicago did not transform into a Euro-American place because of a military conquest nor a settler expansion, but by an overhauling of its geography through government-backed improvements to the lands and waters around the ancient portage site. Between 1816 and 1836, American officials pursued a series of public works projects at Chicago meant to tame the marshland southwest of Lake and transform the upper Illinois country into a productive landscape that would serve the U.S. Republic. In 1816, a delegation of American negotiators brokered for a 20-mile wide corridor of land between Lake Michigan and the Illinois River for the future construction of a proposed canal. Statehood and surveys along the upper Illinois followed in 1818, and by 1822, Congress had designated the lands around Chicago's portage for a federally endorsed canal. In 1828 and again in 1831, Congress earmarked funds for harbor improvements. Illinois funded the construction of the first bridges across the Chicago River in 1832, and in 1833, government contractors had begun construction of both the harbor and a set of piers. By 1836, only 20 years after U.S. officials returned to Chicago, government investment rendered the ancient portage route irrelevant by breaking ground on the Illinois and Michigan Canal. This public works project promised to unite the waters of the continent in a rebuilt system of artificial waterways designed to serve a new settler economy in the region. This transformation of Chicago's local environs significantly reshaped the balance of power between the area's Anishinaabe and Euro-American traders on one hand, tipping the scales in favor of incoming government officials and eventually Eastern land speculators, businessmen, and migrants. By overhauling this local watery geography and in turn the regional patterns of waterborne movement, American officials sought to bring a more legible, winnable topography to Chicago, one that officials could understand and control better than the older indigenous portage system. By viewing Chicago's transformation in this way as a two-pronged conquest of both the local people and the local space, we can better understand U.S. efforts and eventual successes in subjugating the continental interior. Now, such developments did not go unnoticed by Chicago area Anishinaabe, who remained uneasy about American designs towards Chicago from 1816 on. Anishinaabe living near Chicago, along the Michigan shoreline, in the Des Plaines, Kankakee, Illinois, and Fox River valleys, did not forcefully resist many of these activities, though they still greatly outnumbered American settlers in the region. Their limited use of violence, however, throughout the late 1820s into the 1830s is telling. These local native people directed their aggression against two elements of incoming white settlement, agriculture and infrastructure, rather than white migrants themselves. They wrecked settlers' crops, raided vegetable gardens, Potawatomis along the Illinois River set fire to haystacks to disrupt autumn harvests. They slaughtered hogs, stole horses, and mutilated cattle, all representations of the shifting agricultural regime of Illinois' prairies, which so vexed Chicago's Anishinaabe. Meanwhile, other groups of disgruntled Anishinaabe burnt bridges over key river crossings in the Illinois River country. These acts of low-level violence maintained a certain spatial logic. The Anishinaabe around Chicago, while avoiding open war with the Americans, directed their attacks on the manifestations of the changing landscapes around them. Bridges and building projects altered space, while livestock and crops threatened to unseat indigenous engagement with the wetland and prairie ecosystems. Native individuals that participated in such raiding, vandalism, arson, and theft signaled how well they understood these targets as direct threats to an Anishinaabe way of life in the region. By 1827, Anishinaabe around Chicago's portage had every reason for uneasiness. That spring, the federal government granted a portion of the Canal lands acquired from the 1860 treaty to the Illinois state government. The idea was for these lands running 5 miles inland on either side of the proposed canal along the Des Plaines and Upper Illinois rivers was to be sold in lots, with the proceeds from such sales going towards the actual canal construction. It was no coincidence that particularly destructive spate of native depredations came in the months after these first government land sales along the canal route. Restructuring Chicago's space, however, would require more than just waves of agrarian settlers buying up land along a proposed canal. It also required an unprecedented level of government investment and state capacity. In 1831, for instance, federal funding and expertise made way for the first steps in this overhaul, the construction of a lighthouse to guide navigation through the notoriously treacherous waters off Chicago. Congress allotted $5,000 to build a 50-foot structure along the shoreline. And even though this first lighthouse fell, within 6 months, federal funds financed the construction of a second lighthouse near the same spot. The federal government would further invest in Chicago by earmarking an additional $25,000 for the proposed harbor improvements you see pictured here, effectively rerouting the Chicago River, building a series of piers, and restructuring Chicago's lakefront. Chicago's regional and state level boosters, however, viewed investment in infrastructure as only one component to their overall vision for Chicago's transformation as an American space. These same individuals who advocated for a conversion of Chicago used threats of indigenous violence during the 1820s and 30s to push for the removal of the Southwestern Anishinaabe from Illinois. Ninian Edwards, the governor of Illinois, saw the livestock killings and crop thefts perpetrated by Chicago's Anishinaabe in 1827 as providing an opportunity for the government to, quote, drive them from their present residence and gain the lands for ourselves. Officials from Illinois and neighboring states, their intentions clear, assembled the Anishinaabe in Chicago in 1833 to secure the area once and for all for the United States and to eliminate an indigenous hold over this strategic site. The commissioners hosted perhaps the largest gathering of Native people ever to assemble on Chicago's prairies, with estimates from the time ranging as high as 8,000 Anishinaabe gathered there. After 2 weeks of negotiating, the Anishinaabe sessions of 1833 laid the land open for U.S. encroachment and solidified the Anishinaabe removal westward within the next 3 years. Changes would come quickly to Chicago after this final treaty. Further investment in infrastructure, more land sales by the state and federal government to incoming settlers, and the eventual influx of Eastern capital would drive Chicago's ongoing development into a place of American commerce and power that we're more familiar with. Here's a map of the Canal Zone, giving you an idea of these land plots that were for sale and in development during this time. And finally, on the 4th of July, 1836, the Illinois State Canal Commissioners gathered at the newly renamed Canal Port along the southern branch of the river near the old terminus of the portage to conduct an elaborate groundbreaking ceremony for the canal. The ceremony for those gathered officials represented the physical manifestation of Chicago's transition away from the old indigenous portage geography that had bolstered the fur trade and Anishinaabe power in the region, and towards a more familiar, legible American landscape. It proved no coincidence that American dignitaries broke ground on the Illinois and Michigan Canal the same month the Southwestern Anishinaabe conducted a final ceremony of departure along Chicago's river. In early August of 1835, 5,000 Anishinaabe from Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin encamped one last time outside Chicago to accept their annuity payments and prepare for their supervised removal west of the Mississippi. Assembling on the north bank of the river, these Anishinaabe prepared to bid farewell to the lands and waters that they had controlled so well for so long. John Caton, the local justice of the peace, witnessed the ceremony, what he called, quote, the last war dance, and recorded the Southwestern Anishinaabe's farewell ritual in detail. Over 800 Anishinaabe men joined in what Caton equated to, quote, a sort of funeral ceremony as they grieved the loss of their native soil. The Anishinaabe mourners had stripped and painted themselves for the occasion and proceeded along the bank of the river while they cried, sang, beat drums, and brandished war clubs. As officials from Chicago and greater Illinois pursued their ongoing visions for a remade environment, meanwhile, Chicago's Anishinaabe took their leave of this rewritten landscape. By 1836, then, it seemed Chicago's boosters at the national, state, and local levels had achieved the ultimate coup. They had conquered a space that for centuries had proven intractable to European imperial ambitions. As white Americans re-envisioned Chicago's space, and the US government invested in reconstructing Chicago's geography, Chicago's native people found themselves in a disorienting and disempowering new landscape. This landscape lent itself instead to white settler logics of movement, exchange, and production. By 1836, when most of the region's Anishinaabe were forced west of the Mississippi River, Chicago had been remade into a site of white settler authority and potential prosperity. Chicago as an American city replaced not only a natural environment of wetlands, prairies, and lakeshore, but also a human geography that had facilitated a much longer history of mobility, prosperity, and exchange in the Great Lakes. Only by returning the intertwined history of Chicago's native removal to its more recognizable story of urban growth and infrastructure development can we appreciate the full ramifications of the American conquest of the continental interior. This remained both a story of indigenous dispossession and internal improvements, of an expanding settler political economy and an environmental degradation. Chicago as an important site in the earlier indigenous world of the interior and later as a place of American prosperity provides a window into retracing these mutually reinforcing processes of conquest at the local level. Rather than an exceptional case, Chicago's local trajectory demonstrates the wider transformation, human and physical geography of the Great Lakes and the American interior during this era of US expansion. Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce our next presenter, and I'm going to kind of reduce the biography a little bit so Ramya has enough time. But Ramya is presently finishing her PhD studies at the History Department at Michigan State. Her dissertation is entitled Freshwater Frontier, Island Making, Dredging, and Infrastructure in the Detroit River, 1865 to 1935. She really has published extensively in the journal Water History, and she has recently had an article published by the Michigan Historical Review in their special edition entitled Pure Michigan in Spring 2019. Her article entitled Dredge a River, Make a Nation Great, Shipping, Commerce, and Territoriality in the Detroit River, 1870 to 1905, an article that is, like John's, very crucial articles in the Michigan Historical Review. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ramya.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to try sharing my screen. Can everybody see it? Yes? No? Yes, okay, great. Thank you everyone for being here on an early morning session. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that where I'm presenting from are the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. My paper is going to be slightly different from my other esteemed panelists. I'm going to be using a lot of maps, and hopefully they'll tell a story. So today I'm going to talk about how we envision spaces and, okay, great. Okay. How we envision spaces and what that means for our interpretations of the past. I use the example of the Detroit River because that's the river I study. In so doing, I hope to show how we can train ourselves to think about change over time and space in new and generative ways. Historically, most Western/European actors used two-dimensional drawings to think through these spaces and places. Starting with a blank paper also created a tabula rasa of the mind. Erasure of indigenous peoples, places, and ideology was inevitable when starting with a blank paper. And especially through the colonial imagination of borders and boundaries, which often cast places unknown to the colonizers as vacant or wild. For historians, understanding and analyzing the past through these drawings represents a special challenge. Historians map change over time. Given the variations in map making, scales, etc., historical maps could not be studied alongside one another until recently. In this paper, I visualize data and maps to present comparative lessons. Incorporating quantitative data into these maps, I propose a visual analysis as a means to reveal temporal continuities that reflect geological timescales. In so doing, this paper proposes a new method of historical analysis. Furthermore, I see this paper as contributing to the growing literature in spatial history by more fully integrating place and change over time. Tracing mobility, movement, and migration, this paper aims to understand the relationship between dredging and the making of the Detroit River. Now, dredging, as I've discovered, is a particularly difficult process to visualize. It's, after all, just a bunch of dirt being scooped up, from a river bottom and being dumped somewhere else. In the Great Lakes, dredging has sustained the shipping industry. In the 19th century, the Detroit River was the most important commercial waterway in the United States, as well as globally. To keep up with shipping demands, the river had to be dredged. Now, for environmental historians, shipping is significant simply because of the changes it wrought. First, to allow ships to sail in and through the lakes, there were massive infrastructural projects like the Erie Canal and the Sioux Locks. Second, to make sure there was a guaranteed depth or draft, channels needed to be dredged. But dredging wasn't just about carving channels. It altered, as I hope to show, the very fabric of river and lake systems. I studied dredging in the lower Detroit River, where it not only created, a shipping channel, but also created new islands. Now, today, if you look at, this map in the background of the lower Detroit River, you don't really see where nature ends and human interventions begin. You can see a lot of straight lines. You can see an inverted triangular island, which was built completely out of dredging dump in the 20th century. And the idea was that this island would help ships navigate upbound and downbound channels more efficiently. Following this creative process, of creating infrastructure through maps, graphs, and sectional drawings gives us greater insights into the creative destruction that embodies large-scale infrastructural imagination and construction. In so doing, these maps and visualizations help us get a more granular sense of changes over time and their effects on humans and non-humans. Now, scholarly work on the Detroit River has studied the ecological effects of urbanization and dredging, as well as the ecological health of the river itself. However, there's little work on mapping these spatial relationships between urbanization, ecology, and dredging. Historical data and archival material about dredging is often numerical, giving the historian little or no clues to what it might mean. Visualizing this data, on the other hand, especially through maps as well as changes in bathymetry, helps us understand why dredging is important and its footprint. Analyzing these maps reveals the change over time while spatializing change. These diagrammatic maps, as I'm going to present, outline, essentially changes over time. All right. What are edge conditions, you might ask, and why are they important? Edge conditions, I think I jumped a slide, yeah. Edge conditions are changes in, the bank coastlines, wetland footprints, as well as changes in island contours. Edge conditions help us understand change over time. They show us what map makers wanted us to see, which is, where villages were, where cities came up. They also show us what map makers were perhaps not particularly interested for us to see, like borders and, how infrastructure can be easily seen on these maps. I'm using a series of 5 maps from 1764 to 2015 to tell a story of deep transformation. These are not the only maps, nor are they the most comprehensive maps. These maps are representational in that I've cherry-picked, I guess, a map from each era and sort of put them together to give us a richer analytical landscape. Now, yeah. So if you look at the map on the left, this is a 1764 map of the Detroit River area. And this is perhaps the only one of its kind, and it's often labeled as the earliest surviving map of French Detroit. The 19th century map, drawn when the War of 1812 was still raging on, reveals not only reveals change in terms of, greater urbanization, but also the lack of a political border. It wasn't until the War of 1812 that the US-Canada border was understood by both sides of the river in any substantive form. And now, so it's only, when you look at the 20th century map that a political border becomes really visible. By 1870, let's see, yeah. By 1870, both sides of the Detroit River were colonized by farmers and small merchants. Initially, wetlands along the river were used by settlers, but with time, these were diked and cleared for pasture and cropland. And by 1900, croplands were cleared as agricultural settlement spread inland. And so the 1950s 1915 map shows, so 1910 map shows you just how there's complete lack of wetlands and how slowly the edge conditions are getting hardened. The 1915 map shows at the bottom, a bunch of straight lines, which is essentially the creation of a whole new channel in the lower Detroit River. Also crisscrossing, notice crisscrossing on both sides of the river are these railroad lines. Now, if you look at the 2015 map, you still have a whole bunch of lots of straight lines and superbly hardened edge conditions, but the beginnings of wetlands, simply because throughout the 20th century, the Detroit River was so badly polluted that there was increased attention on the river. And starting with the 1980s, there's been an increased desire to restore wetlands and habitat. Now, if you look at habitat changes, between the 18th and 21st century, there have been massive habitat changes along the river. At first glance, it's easy to see how wetlands disappeared, right? So like by the early 20th century, there are no wetlands. Historically, the Detroit River supported the largest lake whitefish fishery, which operated from 1830 to about 1920. And other fish species commonly harvested commercially during the era were walleye, lake sturgeon, and largemouth bass. The collapse of the whitefish industry has been attributed to pollution, the creation of artificial channels, and overfishing. For instance, in the Detroit River, it was in the early 20th century, the Army Corps constructed a channel along this part of the river, which is near Fighting Island, and destroyed one of the biggest spawning habitats of the lake whitefish. Whitefish then started disappearing slowly. The numbers of whitefish caught reduced, and so much so that lake whitefish temporarily just stopped running the Detroit River for over 70 years. Given that 2/3 of the Michigan shoreline is full of retaining walls, residences, factories, and freight locks, the loss of fish habitat along with overfishing was a major factor in the extinction of lake sturgeon as well, which were which used to spawn, especially in the lower half of the river. Like I mentioned earlier, between the 1940s and 1960s, oil pollution was a major factor in the Detroit River, which led to the death of wintering ducks and other waterfowl. And eutrophication of Lake Erie has been linked to the phosphorus deposited into it by the Detroit River. But since the 80s, like I mentioned earlier, once the Detroit River was designated as an area of concern due to its degraded water quality, there's been a concerted effort to restore the river. Now, this is perhaps the most exciting part of this presentation for me. For this part of the presentation, what I did was I compared two maps, one before dredging and one after dredging, and I created 3 sectional drawings, one at the head of the river, one towards the middle, and the third towards the lower end of the river. And the idea was to see, to sort of compare how the river bottom has changed and hopefully tell us more. So during the 1870s, a depth survey of the Detroit River by the Army Corps revealed a U-shaped channel with a sandy bottom. Now, along the river shorelines, there was emergent vegetation that could grow up to 2 meters deep. To give you a sense, between 1874 and 1968, when the Detroit and St. Clair rivers were dredged to the maximum, over 40 million cubic meters of stuff was dredged up from the river, and which covered thousands of hectares of river bottom, and there was hundreds of hectares of above ground construction that was done. Now, modification of the Detroit and St. Clair rivers actually led to a permanent drop in the levels of lakes Erie and Michigan, lakes Huron and Michigan by 20 to 25 centimeters. So now these sectional drawings, as I said, tell you a story. So for instance, this first drawing, which is near Belle Isle, one can see that the river depths have actually been augmented. So sorry, I forgot to mention that the drawings on the top are from 1844 and the bathymetry from 2015 is at the bottom. So when you compare these two, you get a sense of how much the river bottom has changed. And near Belle Isle, you get a sense that it's followed the original contours, but the river's shrunk a little. Now, this near Fighting Island, the river looks, it still follows the same contours, but you begin to see that near in Canadian waters, actually, the river seems to be doing better in that, it seems to be shallower. And this is corroborated by the fact that there are increased wetlands in that part of the river. Now this, the part of the river that's undergone the most amount of change. Here you can see, a gradually U-shaped channel was replaced by a heavily carved set of channels and a human-made island, where once stood 7 to 10 feet of water. Much of the qualitative and quantitative archival data on this dredging gives us only a partial sense of the changes at hand. Sources tell us that this Livingston Channel, this thing, was built where there used to be about 5 feet of water. While we, what we don't fully understand is, what we don't understand from this data is how much the river's bed changed, not just for the width and length of the Livingston Channel itself, or even for the length of the shipping channel, but for surroundings as well. This part of the river was an important spawning ground, like I mentioned, for lake sturgeon. With that spawning ground lost, an already depleted fish population was pushed over the edge. Lake sturgeon were in fact not seen back in the Detroit River until the early years of the 21st century. These sectional drawings help us understand why and how. For historians, it maps change over time in dramatic ways that archival sources may not always be able to capture. It also points ways in which ecologists and conservationists could perhaps approach habitat restoration. So you may ask, so what? Now, integrating environmental data into historical research by merging data with spatial representation gives us a fuller view of the river's historical experience. Such an analytical lens, I believe, makes us more rounded historians for a variety of reasons. One, such an analysis responds to the spatial turn in the humanities in a substantive manner, using methods borrowed from architectural history and landscape architecture to help us understand in a more frontal and granular manner the scale of change over time. Two, in so doing, such an analysis helps us compare the multitude of events together, offering important insights that may be lost otherwise. For instance, look at this graphic, which is visualizing river flow alongside dredging, as well as major socio-cultural events. Now, looking at this graph, it's easy to see that, the years of peak flow actually saw the least amount of dredging. Now, I don't know why that is, but at least I know that this happened. And it lets me ask a question of why did this happen? And I think three, it pushes historians and perhaps environmental historians more so to think more spatially and visually. Such thinking is perhaps the rational end of the spatial turn. A visually and spatially informed historical vocabulary would also have a more discernible moral, ecological, and social compass. Thanks again.
Thank you, Ramya, very much. I'd like to turn now to our commentary by Bob Morrissey. And many of you know Bob because he teaches at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His first book, which many of us have read and thoroughly enjoyed, is Empire by Collaboration, Indians, Colonists, and Governments in the Colonial Illinois Country, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. For those of you that are really interested in another incredible article that he has written very recently in Past and Present, you can find Bob's article, which gives us a view into his next project. It's called Climate, Ecology, and Social Frontiers from 1200 to 1850 in the Past and Present Journal. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to commentary by Bob. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Susan. And thank you very much for inviting me to comment on this panel. Susan and I know each other as early American historians of Indigenous America. But I don't know, Susan, if you knew that ever since I moved to East Central Illinois, I've become somewhat obsessed with the history of ditches and agricultural drainage. And frankly, I don't meet many people who share my obsession. It's a small world of drainage buffs, I've found. And here in this room is not just one fellow traveler, but three very talented historians working on drainage or adjacent issues. So I'm really thrilled. I'm overflowing with excitement. I'm flooded with enthusiasm. I'm really digging it. All right. Well, I want to keep my comments somewhat short. There's time for questions, but I do want to note that these papers seem to be starting or joining what I view as a very important conversation, one that we as Midwestern historians might do well to amplify and to run with, and take it as far as it will go. Now, as an environmental historian, I am of course aware that much environmental history of other regions revolves around water. Dating back to Walter Prescott Webb, for instance, people have organized the entire regional history of the American West around the theme of water, and specifically the lack of it, right? Beyond the 100th meridian, aridity is the central condition of the West, shaping its history. And Donald Worster then came along and wrote an interpretation of the American West that said that water engineering was at the heart of that whole region's story. So the American West, like certain parts of China, like certain parts of Brazil, was a hydraulic civilization. It was defined by water and by water engineering. Now in the Midwest, we are not used to thinking about water as the most important shaper of our history, mostly because it's not scarce, right? It did not limit what happened here. Quite the contrary. Water's abundance here makes it seem like Webb's or Worcester's insights are almost completely irrelevant to a regional story. Water could not be the key to understanding our regional history or the regional identity of the Midwest. But here's a devil's advocate argument that I suppose Ramya, John, and Dale might all agree with. No less than in the American West, no less than the American West, the Midwest's history has indeed been shaped by water. Only in our case, the headline issue has not been aridity, but rather flatness. Here's what I mean. Everybody knows that the key moment of forming the Midwest region was the glaciers, which ironed out the landscape, making it table flat. But as these papers show, those formative ice sheets had very crucial implications for hydrology. Namely this: in a flat land, water doesn't move. It sits there, it floods. If Richard White told us to think about rivers as workers, right, as in the Columbia River, the organic machine, well, Midwestern waters seem to do very little work, or at least they do their work very slowly. If water gathers up steam at all in the Midwest, it quickly slows down and then it drops whatever is in it, siltifying and filling up usually very shallow bodies of water and overspilling them. The result: wetlands, swamps, meandering rivers, and shallow waters of all kinds. And so the key engineering of this region was not damming and et cetera. It was unflattening, right? It was dredging, ditching, tiling, draining, straightening, and getting the slow moving water going, making the shallow water deep, separating, and with a nod towards John McPhee and Christopher Morris's work on the Mississippi River, separating the wet and the dry, replacing the swampy portage with an efficient canal, digging new contour into a flat land. Much of the infrastructure that did this work, the ditching and the draining, was as profound as the engineering of the Western landscape. The Colorado River has nothing on the wetlands of the Midwest as a case study of radical ecological transformation or a case study in heroic progressive era conservation. But unlike improvements like the Hoover Dam, much of what transformed this landscape is invisible. it's literally buried like the drainage tiles in Dale's paper, or sunken like the channels in Ramya's Detroit River. Most of all, it's taken for granted, like the Chicago shoreline in John's paper. To echo William Cronin, here we have a case of a just so landscape transformation. This is second nature, right? Isn't this how it always was? We might ask ourselves, looking out at this landscape. Well, as these papers show beautifully, of course, the answer is no. Instead, these landscape changes were very much the work of modernity, the simplification of prior landscapes. In John's case, internal improvements were the euphemism for wetland eradications, which were fiercely resisted by Anishinaabe communities. For those people, the older landscapes were not just productive wetlands shaped and harvested as a tended wilderness, but they were also home. As John shows, their removal was part and parcel of the modern re-engineering of those wetlands and those prairies and those shorelines, those complex edge habitats where game was abundant, but order, in that sort of high modernist sense, was fugitive, right? In Dale's paper, we learn of the Great Black Swamp, a massive wetland, which was one of the more productive and diverse ecosystems of this flatland before settler colonists drained it up. Ironically, and I love this part of your paper, Dale, ironically using the swamp's own extensive clay deposits to manufacture the tiles, that is the drain pipes, to exclude the water, right? To separate the wet from the dry. What an irony. The ecosystem transformation could not have been more profound, though so many Midwesterners hardly know about it, right? My obsession with this issue has me very conscious of our regional ignorance on this score, how we all drive by the large spools of PVC tiles, right, pipes that sit in most Corn Belt fields in the winter months, waiting to be inserted into the ground. We're oblivious to what those things are, right? That's a massive infrastructure. That is a huge, I mean, Dale's numbers about just how many miles of clay pipes are in the ground, that's the only thing that's more astonishing than that is the number of plastic pipes that are now in the ground, right? Again, second nature. We take it for granted. Now, in a Ramya's fantastic paper, we learn about a slightly different kind of unflattening. Not so much draining, but dredging, cutting contour into the river in order to make it navigable. Again, this is a process of modernity resisting that slow motion organic machine, the slow deposition, alluviation, aggradation, whatever you want to call it, of the river bottom, the aquatic environment. I love how Ramya's focus is on the process of making this infrastructure. And it reminds me of Ashley Carse's great work on the Panama Canal, whose constant requirements to be remade, right, commit its managers to certain practices and to certain politics. Ramya's special innovation is to bring these changes to light in visualization. And I really, really admire the work. So I want to end this comment, where I'm just trying to kind of synthesize and think about the connections here. I want to end with a word of very strong encouragement. I simply love Ramya's visualizations, both because they're really powerful. Who knew you could do historical bathymetry like this? But also because they are metaphorically so powerful. I'm not the first to observe that the eradication of the Midwestern wetlands are among the most important landscape transformations in North American history. And I know that other historians have written artfully about the way that engineering did shape our region, right? That said, I don't think I'm exaggerating too much when I acknowledge that most people never think of it, right? Eutrophication in Lake Erie, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, those are downstream consequences of water engineering in the Midwest. What I think we desperately need is a way to help ourselves and others see this history, an awareness of the wetland, of this, very interesting and dynamic flatland as a dramatic and charismatic landscape that was drained up, right? History like these papers is, I believe, urgently necessary to recover these stories, to unbury the engineering, to pull up those tiles and to look at them in the light of day. Modernity not only exaggerated when it called these internal improvements, it also rendered them and their consequences permanent and invisible. historical work like this has the potential to build momentum for Midwestern environmental history around a key theme of water engineering, right? No less than the West's aridity, water shaped this region and shaped the Midwest. The problem was not too little water, but too much flatness. We need a consciousness about how we fixed this problem and the consequences of those improvements. So thank you to all three of you for really great work in helping along this consciousness. And I want to open it up for questions if we have some time for that, Susan. I don't know if that's called for.
I think we still have about 5 minutes left, but before I even open it up to questions, Ramya, there has been a lot of chat conversation about, would you be willing to share your maps? And I don't know a process of doing that, but perhaps you do, because you are all much more technologically innovative than I am.
I can share my PDF over the chat if that'll help.
Okay. So if you would, thank you. So are there questions that someone would like to pose? You can put them in the chat room, or because we don't have very much time, if you simply unmute and ask your question, I would be more than willing to receive them. Stuart.
Yeah, I have a question. So this is sort of big, broad framing. Charles Mann in 1491 and 1493 kind of throws kind of a gauntlet down on the big picture of change here from the beginning end. But I don't know. I'm a denizen of the Great Lakes region my whole life, and now live in Central Illinois. And so wonder about drainage tile and how it works. But in what ways were indigenous people over time and in changing ways where there is history prior to contact also shaping the environment? Or are we really still predicating a pristine world untouched by humans prior?
John, I see you're shaking your head. Would you like to respond?
Well, sure. I was just going to give a shout out to both Susan and Bob and say that both of their work kind of deals a lot with this question in terms of indigenous people shaping the landscape long before settlers show up, right? Through fire use on the prairies. And I know Bob's written pretty extensively on that before. Susan has shown the extensive kind of ancient agricultural complexes that are in Michigan and Indiana and parts of the Midwest. In terms of Chicago, you also see it there. My work would be would look at that. The Anishinaabe are relative newcomers to the Chicago portage. They don't necessarily move in there in force until the 1740s or so, and they do so very intentionally to gain control of this nexus of waterways, right? So even there you have kind of a conscious effort to control and in effect shape the geopolitical situation of the region by taking control of these strategic waterways. So I think there's a lot of good evidence that, yeah, Native people are definitely movers and shapers of the landscape, maybe not in the same kind of progressive language that we see with the settlers, but definitely very important.
So with that in mind, unless we have any other questions.
If there's no other questions, can I follow up? Then, so the consequence would seem to be that maybe it's not restoration, but more honestly, just a reshaping a new ethos that we're talking about. That we now have a different ethos than we did in mid-20th century, but not, I don't know if you know what I'm getting at. I'll stop.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I think the usable part of that lesson is that this was always a human landscape, right? It was always managed and tended in one sense or another. And so going forward, it's not about restoring or preserving this wilderness idea. It's about managing the landscape in maybe a more sustainable or in tune kind of a way, right? So yeah, I think that's what you're getting at.
So we're at a 2-minute warning, and I really want to thank this panel. Bob, I really want to thank you for tying this all together. These 3 papers just worked beautifully, and your commentary was superb in really shedding light on the unifying ways you can see these 3 papers together. So for everyone, thank you for joining us. But particularly thank you to the panelists for all the hard work you put into this. I appreciate it. And your audience does too. So we will give you all a hand and hope to see you soon.